So let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about where evaluation fits in, because it is a key component of effective planning. Because really, it really allows us to begin with the end in mind. So we've got to think about that in terms of planning at the very beginning. And when we look at planning, planning is really, and there's so many different definitions of planning. I really like these ones because to me, they don't have to be academic, they don't have to be confusing. This is really, for me, what planning is. Planning is figuring out where you are now, where you want to go with your after-school program, and then the steps for how you're going to get there. So when you think about evaluation, how can evaluation not be a part of planning? I think the way that I tend to look at it is that planning really helps us figure out where we want to go, but it's evaluation that's going to tell us if we got there. So we really can't separate those two. And so that's, if you don't take anything else away, think about, and I know you will take more than this away, but really understand that you've got to think about evaluation at the beginning. And I can tell you, from experience, that we used to just think about it at the very end, and I will be one to say I was guilty of that. And in a lot of ways, we were able to get away with that, but not anymore. And it's really in large part because what we're attempting to address in many ways is much more complex. And also there's just an increasing need for accountability, especially when you think about the funding that's coming to us from corporate sponsors or government. It's hard-earned donations or government funding, and so we really have to be accountable for it, especially when there isn't enough to go around. We've got to be accountable. So from the beginning, think about evaluation as it relates to planning. Okay, so let's start talking specifically about your after-school program. And Jennifer is going to take us to these two questions. And this is the same process as before. So the first question that we'd like you to address is how do you currently communicate the value of your after-school program? So, when a funder comes up to you, or an elected official, or a director or a manager or a family member comes up to you and says, what results are you producing? What do you usually provide them with? That's the first question. And the second question gets to more of the specifics. What are the most useful pieces of information? Like, what's the most important data that you collect that helps you increase the effectiveness of your program? Okay, so those are the questions. I'll give you a chance to answer those. Good, thank you. I can see some answers starting to pop up now. That's great. Yeah, good. Okay, so let's wait, I'll give you another moment or so to collect your thoughts. One of the things that is different about this kind of webinar is that we're not going to just push information out at you. We really do know that engagement is an important part of this learning to reinforce it. Many of you I think, already bring a lot of this knowledge, so it might be just a case of reinforcing it. But this engagement piece is essential for us. So thank you for participating. Good. Okay, so how do you currently communicate the value of your after-school program? So, and I love the fact that the first answer was attendance, because I really do believe that that is the most common measure. And there's reasons for that we'll get into, but I think that is most typical. It really is the attendance. There's some great answers here. Inviting others to attend special events so they can experience firsthand what it is you're doing in your program. That's an excellent answer. Good. Showing impact from the kids, tracking the improvements. Good. So some of you are deep into this evaluation already, which is very, very positive. So the feedback, you're collecting the feedback. Good. Social media, parent interaction, reports to funders. Good. because the report that, I know the report that RBC has asked for is a good one. It would give you a lot of really good data. Yep. So the parental feedback, I like that. That's good too. The quantitative data, participant and parent feedback, outcomes for participants, good. You've got the information in your brochure, the programs and activities, the statistics about the numbers. Ooh, there's a good one that you track. Refers to other programs and services. Yep. Videos are good. Good to see that some of you are being creative with how you are really evaluating. That's important. Good. So lots of good ideas there. And we're gonna unpack this just a little bit, but nice to see that variety. And that there's some creativity there as well, that's pretty exciting. So good for you. I can see that there is some experience here that's being shared. That's great. Okay, so the second question was, what are the most useful pieces? And nice to see that there are many of you who have seen the value of the stories. That's really critical, and yet I think too often we forget about stories and testimonials. So a lot of you are tracking benchmarks and improvements and the impact, the number of children served, the feedback on the knowledge or skills gained. Good, good. The testimonials, discussions, case studies. Good. Wow, this is a pretty advanced group, I think, compared to many that we've worked with in the nonprofit sector. So lots of experience here. So thank you for sharing that. That's great. We'll come back to this and refer to your answers as we go back to the slides. So Jennifer's going to help us go back to the slides. There we go. So there's the question. So really, what I think in some ways you've told us is that in a lot of ways we're using somewhat limited business criteria. The criteria that we have, for the most part, been trained to use, which is really the number of participants, the cost or the subsidies, that kind of information. And a lot of times we use quantitative versus qualitative data. So we're often measuring outputs instead of outcomes. So it's more about the number of registrants, that kind of thing, and a lot of you have talked about that. And I also have to say that that is really quite typical. But there is a need, and some of you have already identified that there's this need to generate additional and complementary outcome-oriented indicators and measurements. So more about skills, knowledge, and behaviors. We'll talk a bit about that. But really the main shift, and I don't know about you, but for me this was, this really was a huge shift. And once I wrapped my head around it, nothing was ever quite the same again. But it was really making this shift from seeing what the work that we were doing, not as what we were doing, but why we were doing it. And that's really why the title of this webinar was What's in it for them? Because that really is the why. And that's what we really need to focus on. That's really what we're going to try to emphasize in the webinar today. So part of this is really understanding the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And so that's one thing that we really need to understand. And we also need to understand that we are doing more on the side of quantitative data, and we need to shift more to do more on the qualitative side. So we're going to it's kind of end this section. At the end of each kind of section, we're going to do a little bit of a quiz. So make sure that you do understand these differences, and if you have any questions, jump in, whether it's through the chat or through putting your hand up and unmuting your phone. But it really is important to understand the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And so when you think about it, this should be simpler. I don't know why it took me a long time to kind of wrap my head around this, but quantitative data is about the quantity. So it's obviously about the data that we're collecting that can be expressed as a number or quantified in some way. So it's really about numbers of participants, the costs, the test scores. So it's things that can be quantified. And quite honestly, in many ways we're doing it because it is easier. Because it is something that is definitive. It's a number. And that makes it different from qualitative data, because qualitative data, it's not about a number. It's really answering the question, is it good? Or what is it like? It's more about feelings and thoughts and behavior, and it's much more varied. And I think that's important to understand, especially for anyone who has a foot in the nonprofit sector or is doing any work that involves human services, because we're dealing with a different side of the ledger. It's not the ledger side that's about numbers. It's another ledger that is much more about feelings and thoughts and behaviors. So if you're struggling with this, that's why. It's because we have to make this shift from quantitative data to qualitative data. Okay? So any questions about that? Okay, so I think we're good. Okay, I'm taking that as an okay. Okay, so the other thing that we want to talk about is differentiate between outcomes versus output. And we know that typically this is a challenge. And I really do think that, once this is understood, that it will make so much of your work in evaluating so much simpler. So outcomes really focus on why you're offering a program or a service. So in this case, why are you offering an after-school program? It's not the ends. It's not the what of what you are doing in that program. It's really the ends versus the means. That's the difference. It's the end result. It's answering the question why. And in the in the field of evaluation, outcomes are typically thought of as being short-term or immediate, intermediate, and longer term. And when you're talking about longer term, quite often the literature refers to that as being more of an impact. So that's one of the things, again, one of the things that makes it challenging to really articulate outcomes. But once you wrap your head around that and can think about your program in terms of the outcomes they're going to deliver right away versus intermediate versus long-term, I think it helps. I know it certainly helped me. So in general, those short-term outcomes focus on changes in knowledge and attitudes. And so when you think about a hierarchy of learning, the first stage in learning is really to increase a person's knowledge and attitudes. That's kind of where you start. And then more intermediate is really where you will start to see changes in behaviors. Longer term, it's about the focus on the larger impact of your program in the community. So even thinking about outcomes that way hopefully will simplify it. The outputs, on the other hand, are all the things that you do, that you focus on, the activities that you do or provide. So that is the distinction between the two. So a little bit more in terms of outcomes. So this is, and I think this is what's really important for the critical and important work that you're doing in after-school programs. Your outcomes truly are about creating a better future. So they're the conditions that you want to create, not only for the individuals, for the children you use in your program, which is, it's them individually, which is on a more micro scale. But think about what you're doing for the broader community on a larger scale, on a more macro level. So that's a big spectrum. It does create challenges, but it also speaks to how meaningful your work is. I know that when I was working at the Boys and Girls Clubs, we knew we were making a difference in kids' lives. We know that we saved kids' lives in a number of cases. And yet it was difficult to prove that, to articulate that. And yet when you are able to do that, it really does speak to how meaningful an investment your programs are. So that's what we're thinking about when we're defining outcomes. It's the desired end results. I mean, really, why does your after-school program exist? If the funding were cut tomorrow and the program, this is the best way for me, the way I really could think about outcomes. What would happen if your program got axed tomorrow? So what? I mean, and that's what a lot of funders will say. So what? What's going to be different if you weren't around tomorrow? And that's what you've got to answer when you come up with the outcomes, which is a shift from how we often focus. We often focus on the what, what it is we're doing, the means as opposed to the ends. And we've got to start with the outcomes and what it is we want to do that's going to make a difference. Okay? Another way of kind of thinking about outcomes are to examine the key characteristics. And this is where I know I often made mistakes in terms of coming up with outcomes. But if you think about this, they really have to state only a single end state or result. And too often in our outcome, we'll use the word and or. So we'll say something about having an impact on the physical literacy and confidence levels. You can't have two outcomes in one statement. So you've got to think about this on a single end result. You do have to think about and be more specific about the expected direction or the amount of change. And sometimes this will take a while to evolve, and it's somewhat experimental in nature, but you've got to give it some thought from the very beginning. You've got to think about the performance. What is going to change in whom by when? So what gets measured, it gets done. And so if you don't assign some who and some when, it's not going to happen. That's just the reality of our workplaces these days. We're just all stretched pretty thin. So the second last point is kind of important because an outcome, the last 2 points actually, an outcome is really only something that you can influence. You can't really control it. You can put all the conditions in the environment in place, but you can't control it. You can only influence it. That's what makes it an outcome, and that's how you differentiate between an outcome and an output. Okay? And so any questions so far? So far, so good? Okay, so let's go down a little bit deeper. This is probably the slide that helped me the most in terms of coming up with outcomes. And this is based on work that was done by another funder that has really influenced measurement across North America. And this was from the Kellogg Foundation, who funded United Way of America to do some additional research. And what they said was that when we're thinking about outcomes, the difference we're going to make with children and youth in our programs, they typically fell within 7 different categories, or well, I guess probably category is the best way, or different types of outcomes. And the outcomes are what's listed here in those brackets. So the outcomes tend to fall under one of these. And even if you examined each of these and said, well, what are we trying to change in terms of knowledge? What are we trying to change in terms of attitude, which is the second one? What values do we want to influence? What skills do we want to influence? What behavior? What conditions? What status? And so I've just given you an example for each of those 7 categories to give you an idea of how each of those 7 categories is slightly different. Now, you may not and will not likely be able to deliver outcomes in all 7 of those categories, but it's a great jumping off point for the discussion. And I think that's really important. I know that when the first time, and I think the shift for me happened one of the first times I was working with, in this case it was a literacy group, and I was asking that, I shared this information with them and asked them to really think about the outcomes that they were delivering. And actually before I gave them this slide, the answer that they gave to me, and I think they looked at me like I really wasn't all that wise, because I asked them what their outcome was, and they kind of looked at me. It was like, duh, we teach people to read. And when you think about it, that seemed and is important, and yet when they started to talk to their end users, in this case it was mainly teens and adults that they were teaching to read, they asked them what their outcomes were. And it totally changed the answers, because really these literacy organizations really thought that their only outcome was about teaching people to read. But when they asked people about their takeaway in terms of these different categories, the answers were much different, and things that in many cases they hadn't thought about, because they were things like the participant said, there's less anger and frustration in my life because I can read now. My family relationships, my relationships with my kids and my wife are so much better, in large part because I'm more confident. I've got more opportunities for jobs. And even one of the outcomes was about hope, that they were hopeful. They were much more hopeful about the future. Those are outcomes, and those are powerful outcomes. They're not as much about the output, which is really more about the reading, but it's really the difference being able to read would make in a person's life. So it's a shift, and I think these 7 categories, these 7 categories may help. Okay? Anybody, just out of curiosity, have people seen those 7 categories before? I'm hoping that you have. If you have, can you just put up your hand, use that little person there, and put up your hand? So some of you, yeah. Some of you have. Good. Okay. Good. Okay, so for some of you, these categories are new, and for some of you have seen them and hopefully are working with them as well. Great. Good. Okay. So the other technique that I wanted to share with you is really just this technique that's really called the five whys. And this is a technique that you may want to use with your own program and those who are involved. That kind of gets you past the what, the means of what you are doing, and the how-tos to get you to the ends or the outcomes. And it's just a case of continuing to ask why. If somebody will, if I use the literacy example, the first why would have been we teach people to read. And when you say why, you might get to, well, it's an important life skill. Why? And you keep asking the why. Usually, on average, you have to ask why about 5 times. But when you get to the point where you can't ask why anymore, then that's an outcome. Okay? So we've shared information now about qualitative versus quantitative data, and we've shared information about outcomes versus outputs. So in an anonymous way, we're going to share our understanding of what those terms mean, because they're so critically important to evaluation. So there's 4 questions on the first slide. There's more than 4. There's 4 questions in terms of quantitative and qualitative data, and then we'll go to another set of questions about outcomes versus outputs. Okay, so nice that you're all jumping in there. Thank you for that. Good. I'm going to give a moment because it doesn't look. Oh, now we're seeing more people participate. I can't tell who has participated, but we can tell that oh, there we go. 17 people have answered already. Yay! Okay, good. And it looks like this is a very smart group who have been paying attention. That's excellent. I think sometimes people who take the training are the ones who may not need it. The ones who don't take it are the ones who need it the most. And that seems to be the case here. I think we're doing well in terms of the answers. So Jennifer, if you don't mind broadcasting the results so everyone can see how everyone else answered. We didn't show you that at the beginning. We didn't want you to be influenced by other people's answers. And it looks like this is a pretty smart group, because the first one, quantitative data is more varied than qualitative data in nature, and that's false. because quantitative data you can count. So there's not a lot of variation. Yeah. The second question, quantitative data is definable by numbers and letters. That's false. Sorry. Quantitative data is definable by numbers or letters. And that's true. Sorry. I'm not even reading properly. Sorry. Okay. Qualitative data is associated with expression of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And yes, that's true. You're so smart. And the fourth one, qualitative data can never be quantified or measured. And I can see why that's actually a tough question. Some of you did get that wrong because the answer is false. And you can actually quantify qualitative data. It's harder to do in a way that you can say without a doubt is accurate. But it is possible. And probably one of the most important things that I've learned is being able to do that using pre and post surveys, really having people evaluate themselves at the beginning or having others observe them at the beginning and then again at the end. So if you have a beginning and an end, you can quite often quantify qualitative data. So very good. On the whole, look at your accuracy rates here. We're probably averaging about 90% accuracy rate. So obviously this group has a good understanding of quantitative data versus qualitative data. So good for you. So now we're going to go to what might be a little trickier, not sure because you're doing well, is really the difference between, we want to examine the difference between outcomes and outputs. So we have a combination of outcomes and outputs listed here, and we're going to ask you to check off all of those that you see as being outcome-based statements. So which of these are an outcome? So ignore all the outputs and check the ones that are outcomes. Okay. Looks like we're getting there. Good, okay. I think most of us are done here. Okay, so let's look at, now if these are either outcomes or outputs. So I'm going to do these in order and look at the first one. So an average of 20 kids attended. That's not an outcome. Some of you did think it was an outcome. It's an output because it's the means. It's not an outcome in that it is not showing how you have made a difference. It simply showed that 20 people showed up. And it's not that that's not an important measurement, but it's an output and not an outcome. The second one, participants' understanding of the importance of education increased. That's an outcome, and the majority of you got that accurate. So that's great. Wonderful. The third one down, 85% of kids in youth participated the entire school year. That's an output as opposed to an outcome. Participants took part in structured physical activity each day. That's an output, not an outcome. Right? 15 participants from lower income families attended the program. That's an output. Participants' confidence has improved. Yeah, that's an outcome. And it should be clear that that's an outcome because you can only influence that. You can't control that. You can hopefully contribute to that. And you can actually measure it if you had participants assess their own confidence levels at the beginning of your program and then maybe several months later. Then you could measure it. But again, it's an outcome as opposed to an output. Participants are making more positive use of free time outside of the program. That's an outcome. Yes. And program revenue increased by 10%. You know, most of you did identify that as an output, and again, it's because of the numbers. I think that might have influenced, but in many ways that is an outcome, because if your outcome is related to sustainability, that is an outcome as opposed to an output. Kind of falls on the fence somewhere. What the point I was trying to make is that it's not just about the numbers, it's about whether it's about the means or the end. Okay? And participants' sense of being part of a community was strengthened. Yeah, that's an outcome. And presentations from a variety of community organizations were held. Okay? And some of you identified that as an outcome, and again, I do believe that is more of an outcome, or kind of on the fence. It's, you know, this is why this is hard, because in some ways it's an outcome because what you want to do is engage and involve the community, but it's an output because it's part of the means. So some of these are not going to be really clean, and that's one of the points that I wanted to make with this. But what is important is the journey that you make in terms of figuring out what the priorities are for your program that are being funded by your funders, and that the outcomes and the outputs that your stakeholders are looking for. Okay? So thank you for participating. I can tell you this is, I haven't done this exact webinar before, but I have done some forms of evaluation webinars, and I used to teach it at the college level. And those results are very strong compared to many others. So your experience is showing. So my guess is this is not your first rodeo for some of you, that you've had to make this distinction before between outcomes and outcomes. So thank you for participating. What this is reinforcing is that your stakeholders don't buy into what you do. They buy into why you do it. So all of this evaluation, the shift is really about thinking more about why you're offering the after-school program. And it sounds like some of you are doing that already. But it's more about why, as opposed to the activities or the things that you do. So the ends versus the means. And a lot of times I see this reflected in marketing materials, program marketing materials. The program marketing materials really focus on the what is happening in that after-school program, as opposed to what the kids are going to walk out of at the end of the program that they didn't have in the beginning. It's another way of thinking about an outcome. What's going to be different for the participants at the end that wasn't there in the beginning? What's the change that's going to happen? And even in your marketing brochures, that's what people are going to buy into, is the ends, the why, the outcome. This is just a graphic that I pulled together to reflect what the research is showing us, and I think this reinforces everything that we just talked about. The data we collect is typically quantitative or qualitative, so you'll see that across the horizontal bar at the top, and on the vertical bar you'll see the two different options of one being focused on the means or the process, and the second one being focused on the ends or the outcomes. So really, in terms of evaluation, the least important is the one that focuses on the process and the quantity. How much service did we offer? And unfortunately, I think that's where we place too much of our energy. The second quadrant is the second most important is the upper right-hand quadrant, which really answers the question, how well did we deliver? And so that's really about the process and the qualitative data. So how well did we deliver? Okay? And the bottom left-hand quadrant is really about the ends. How much change for the better did we produce? And the fourth one, which is the most important, is what quality of change for the better did we produce? And I would suggest that we're weighting these totally backwards in terms of our time and our energy. And in a lot of cases, that's what the funders are seeing as well, too. So we really want to focus more on the ends, the outcomes, as opposed to the process. The process really tells us, did we do what we said we were going to do? And how can we tweak things to make them better? And the bottom two, the outcomes, really are focusing on the difference that we made. And that's really where we need to really invest more of our energy. And I love this slide. This, again, came from United Way of America and the work that they've done in terms of outcome measurement. And I love this because I just think it's really applicable to working with kids. It's not how many worms the bird feeds its young, but it's how well the fledgling flies. And I think what this slide does is make a case for the fact that we've got to focus more on the outcomes, not only from a quantitative point of view, but from a qualitative point of view as well. Okay? So thank you. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. So Gail, was it this slide, this one that you were looking for?
Hi. No, it was a slide. I think for me, I think this really summarizes a lot of what we look for in evaluation and impact reporting. I think it really explains things well, and something that can be used is when you're filling out all your evaluation reports, having that almost at the side of your desk to look back on to make sure you're capturing each piece would be really helpful. I just think it really summarizes things very, very well. So it's a great slide, and I just wanted to make comment about that and highlight it.
Thank you, Gail. So while I have you, do you agree that we've kind of reversed the order here? Is that what you're seeing in terms of the evaluations that you're receiving?
Yeah, I think people really focus on how much service they deliver, so the numbers. And I find, too, that in the past, that's what funders are really focused on, like how many kids did you support, what were you doing? And where the biggest issue I find with reporting from our partners is the whole qualitative piece, like the whole improved learning skills, improved attitudes towards learning, those pieces, and how they measure them and how they show the outputs, and what tools they use to prove that they've had impact on those spaces. That's where I see the biggest challenge. When we ask the numbers, I don't find are as big an issue, but I think it's the qualitative pieces that are, to your point, probably more important that we have the hardest time with.
Good. Okay. Yeah, because that's what we're seeing as well, too. So thank you for reinforcing that. That's great. Thank you. Appreciate that feedback. Good. Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to say thanks, Agnes, for jumping in. Any of these slides we can make available to you in a larger format. So, yeah. And Agnes, thanks, because it does make sense to put it on the website as a standalone tool. That would be great. Good. Excellent. Okay. I still do like this quote. So what I want to talk about briefly, but I don't know that I need to spend a lot of time on it because I think we've kind of reinforced some of this. But for some of you, this may be a recap. But it took me I was a long way into my work experience before I really understood the different types of evaluation. So I just wanted to talk briefly about that because really what RBC is asking you to do are different types of evaluation. And any funder worth their salt is going to ask you this as well. So you need to think about this from the beginning too. So basically we're seeing three types of evaluation. I use the acronym POD. It just helps me remember them. So process evaluation is one. And we're going to talk about each of these. The second one is outcome evaluation. And the third and emerging form of evaluation is called developmental evaluation. So we'll talk about each of those, and then we'll do a little quiz on that as well. So process, or in the language of the evaluation field, they refer to this as formative evaluation. But it's really about documenting and assessing the program or the initiative as it's being implemented. So you're really focusing on the means, the process that you've used. I think for me, the easiest way to understand this kind of evaluation, and this is important for funders as well, because it's basically answering the question, did you do what you said you were going to do? And for the most part, that's really, that's an important factor for funders to consider because they've provided you with some funding. Did you do what you said you were going to do? Typically, this is something that you can do at the end of as if you planned it at the beginning. You've been collecting the data. You can look at all of this information at the end of it as all of the collective data, all of the data you can look at and assess. And generally, this kind of evaluation is really important because it gives you information about how do you revise or refine or modify your program. So when you're looking at this kind of evaluation, you're dealing with these kinds of topics. So think about this in terms of your after-school program because you're looking at the reach of your program. You're looking at recruitment. You're looking at levels of participation. You're looking at resources. You're looking at the program activities and outputs. You're looking at stakeholder issues, at participants' concerns. You're looking at collecting information about your successes and your challenges. So that's process. That's a process evaluation. And here's some examples that I included, and I don't necessarily need to go through them, but just to give you an idea of what you might be looking at in terms of each of these topics, there's a sample objective of a process evaluation, what it might look like, the data that you're attempting to collect, what it might look like, just as examples. And RBC, look to their credit, they've made things, and this is really, I think as a funder, RBC really needs to be commended because they have, I think, recognized that this is not an easy subject, but they've been very clear about what it is they want you to collect. And I think as funders, they're playing a really important role in terms of collecting the same data from everyone so they can compare apples with apples instead of apples with oranges. So they've given, the application that they've given you, they've told you what they want you to collect. So your job is simply to make sure you have the resources in place to collect this data. So here's one of the, and I've taken this right from the application. So they've also asked you to collect information. They've told you what kind of activities they see and what the research is showing as being important. So from the beginning, this can influence and shape your activities, the activities that are being offered. And I love the fact that it is so diverse. I think one of the most important things I learned working in after-school programming, especially at the Boys and Girls Club, was that too often it seems we program kids everywhere. There's so much of their life these days is programmed. And I love the fact that we, certainly at the Boys and Girls Club, we gave kids options. We gave them choices, and I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that this is, after school is different from in school, from classroom instruction, in that it quite often is less formal, but it's also more about choice. And look at all the activity options RBC is suggesting as being options. Okay? And there's the second page of that. And the third. Okay? So again, that is more process, more of a process or formative evaluation. I also like this particular. This was an example that someone shared with me just recently about an evaluation for an out trip, and I liked it because it was really kind of clean and simple. But again, kind of an example of how you can collect data without making it too complex. And here's another one. This is from a summer camp form, but it combined process and outcome evaluation on one page. So I thought it was a really good example. So this doesn't always have to be complicated, but it takes a lot of time and energy sometimes to get from complicated to simple. So it'll take time. RBC has also asked you about this general reporting. So they again. They have asked you, or they've asked you to collect specific information, hopefully making your life easier. Okay, so that was what I've covered just very quickly is process or formative evaluation, where we want to really stress more emphasis is on outcome evaluation. And again, this is really about making a difference. It has to be done at the beginning of your cycle. And you also really need to look again, and we talked about not only the immediate, but the intermediate and longer term. Typically, the outcome evaluation really focuses on immediate and intermediate, and impact is longer term. But again, the language, the taxonomy is different in many cases and used differently. So you just need to make sure you clarify that. This is typically the difference between outcome evaluation and impact evaluation. Okay, so the impact is really longer, deeper, broader changes that result. And you'll see how we were reflecting that in logic models in some of the examples. Okay, and again, RBC is helping you out here with the benefits. They really asked you to look at the benefits in specific areas, to really articulate the outcome and describe how you're going to measure that. So again, you sure as heck can't do this at the end. You've got to do this as you are rolling out and beginning a program or a new program, or redoing, going into a new cycle. Okay. And again, there's some examples here for you to refer back to as you develop your own. Okay. Again, this is from the RBC application. So they've really done their own homework in terms of being clear about what it is they want you to measure and what they have seen as being important, an important return on investment, on their investment. Okay? And again, in the different areas. So here's health and wellness, here's community impact. Okay? So again, RBC has emphasized, and other funders were hearing the same thing, we need to focus more on these outcomes. And RBC is making it easier for you because what they're doing, they've spelled it out for you. I just wanted to stress that the whole field of evaluation in some ways is changing and shifting. And in a lot of ways it's because what it is we're trying to address is much more complex. And so there's a whole field of evaluation emerging. A lot of it was funded out of the McConnell Foundation in Montreal, but it's really being termed a developmental evaluation. And so it's really a form of evaluation that is used when things aren't quite as clear in terms of the end results. Now, it's not going to be as important for after school. After school is a little more straightforward, but I think it's just really important for you to think about this possibility when you're measuring things that might be more complex. And I think this is really an approach to evaluation where you're working in more innovative or complex settings where the goals kind of emerge and change. So there's this continuous kind of development and adaptation. One of the ways that it was explained to me was that it's not ready, aim, fire with the evaluation in after school. You can do more of that ready, aim, fire. But there may be elements of ready, fire, aim because you're attempting to deal with something new that there isn't a lot of research on, or it's a specific situation. So in those cases, you need to do more of the ready, fire, aim. So that's a different kind of evaluation. And it takes a lot more reflection. It's more a case of using a couple steps forward, adjust and move back, and then move forward. So it's a case of more forward and moving back. It's really like laying the track as the train is rolling. And so that kind of evaluation is becoming more prevalent as we deal with issues such as bullying or obesity or things where we may not have clear answers as of yet. So just be aware of that. And I love this graphic from I've listed it in the references. There's a free manual that deals with this whole topic of a developmental evaluation. This is a graphic from that particular document. And it shows that the traditional approach to evaluation is plan, act, evaluate, whereas developmental is more, it's not linear quite this way. It's more layered in terms of planning and acting and evaluating. But if you're in situations where you need a different kind of evaluation, then it's a really good way to go. It's a good route to go. It's something you need to understand in terms of the different kinds of evaluation. So we're going to really do an attempt right now to assess your understanding of these different kinds of evaluation. So Jennifer's going to take us to a poll. Okay. So I think, Jennifer, we have this spread out over a couple of pages. Is that right? Yeah, I think, if I recall. Yeah. So we're going to do we'll do the first two first, and then we'll go to the next set of questions too. Okay. I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay, so it looks like most of us have answered these two questions. So the type of evaluation that provides information about how to modify or refine a program or a service. And that's the first kind of evaluation that we talked about, which is formative. And it's different from developmental evaluation could tell you to totally turn a program upside down. So it's not just about modifying. So, formative or process evaluation, it's evaluating the process. So it's really about modification or refinement. And we need to do some of that, but that's not where we want to put most of our energy. So, okay, good. Second one, the type of evaluation that tells us whether or not we're making a difference. Oh, sorry, can you take us back? We haven't done question 2 yet. Thank you, Jennifer. Good. The type of evaluation that tells us whether or not we're making a difference. Okay? And you're right, the majority of you got that correct, but it can influence, it can feed into developmental evaluation as well. So if you said developmental, you're not wrong, but most of you really have seemed to a good grasp on what outcome evaluation is. Okay, so good. Let's go to the next set of questions. So we've got 2 more questions here. Okay. It looks like we're getting it because these questions tell us, I think, that we've got a good understanding. The answers tell us we have an understanding. Good. So the type of evaluation that would tell us about program outputs, yep, the correct answer is process. The question number 4, the most common type of evaluation, really across the board, and maybe it's not the case in your particular after-school setting, but really the one that we're using most commonly, where we're putting the emphasis, is on process evaluation. Okay? And the next set, oh, there we go. Good. Now we're rocking it here. I like this. Okay, good. Good. Yep, the type of evaluation that tells us whether or not we're making a difference. Yeah, that's outcome evaluation. Yes. And impact evaluation is a form of summative evaluation. Yes, you are correct. Yep. Good. Okay, and there we are. There are your results, and it looks like the majority of you certainly understand the difference between developmental evaluation and summative and formative. So yes, that is correct. And developmental evaluation, it really is the form of evaluation that is most likely to acknowledge intuitive learnings. And so when we're attempting to learn and do things differently, that's the kind of evaluation we want to learn. So good job. It does look like we are all on the same page.